Hi, everyone. Really delighted to be here with you and kick off the series for this year. Thank you for the introduction. Out of all of those things that were said about me, I am not a climate scientist. I'm actually very new to climate, but I think a lot about social equity, racial justice, etc., from the 10,000-foot view. I like to shape institutions and where we move as a society. And so I try to get involved in those efforts as much as possible. And certainly the work around climate mitigation and climate adaptation is one of the most pressing, if not the most pressing issue of our time. That while climate change is happening to all of us, we're not all impacted equally. We also know that climate change affects neighborhoods that are lower income more than others. We also know that those communities are the least responsible for the crisis that we're in, but they're often impacted the most. So this climate change and inequity intersection really helps us to start to understand degree of impact, who is most gravely impacted, who's being impacted first, who has the resources to respond to, say, extreme changes in temperature. And this is an important part of what we're trying to do and understand as well. For example, in New York City, we know that the Bronx, under some circumstances, is 10 degrees warmer than the temperatures in Central Park and on the Upper West and Upper East sides. And we'll get into this more, but we have lots of historical reasons why that's the case. And we also know that these communities are often less able to, say, afford to be able to run an air conditioner for long periods of time, as if that were great for the climate as well. But the resources to respond to these changes, deal with the consequences of extreme flooding, for instance, are also impeded often in these neighborhoods as well. This is not happenstance. It just doesn't so happen that Black and Brown communities are more likely to be gravely impacted by the climate crisis. So we come to this question of why is that happening and why should we center marginalized and vulnerable communities? So we know that Black and Hispanic communities are exposed to more air pollution than they actually produce. Climate change will cause the most economic harm in these communities. We also know that coastal, largely Black communities in the South are already facing the greatest risk from sea level rise. We also know that discriminatory housing policies like redlining that are more likely to be tied to Black communities are related to these extreme weather events. Having more pavement, fewer trees are related to this higher average temperature. And it's also linked, as I mentioned before, to fewer resources to respond to these conditions. So I just wanted to briefly highlight the underlying reasons for some of these inequities. Why is the Bronx hotter than the Upper West Side? And this is really related to existing structural inequities. So we're asking the question, why are some communities more vulnerable? And this requires us to understand systemic racism among other forms of social inequity and oppression. So we define structural racism as the totality of ways in which societies foster discrimination via mutually reinforcing systems of discrimination. So we're thinking about inequities in housing, education, employment, earnings, et cetera, that turn into a reinforcement of discriminatory beliefs, values, and distribution of resources that create this vicious cycle. On the right, I have a map of Brooklyn from 1938 that really starts to outline the practice of redlining. These are the ways in which boundaries were drawn to say these communities are worth investment and these communities are not. The red areas were considered not worthy of investment. The green areas were considered most valuable, and the yellow areas were falling somewhere in between. And historically, these red areas tended to be predominantly Black. So this is true. This maps on in many ways to what we observe in terms of where communities are in terms of flooding plains, where communities are in terms of who has trees and parks and who has more pavement, and who has more or less resources. And this initial effort to create these boundaries and carve out these spaces have had long-standing impacts that are related to what we're observing in terms of the climate crisis. So low-income housing is often built in flood zones. Flooding disproportionately harms Black neighborhoods, and all of this is linked to this practice of redlining, among many, many other factors. So it doesn't just so happen that the Bronx is hotter. It's not a coincidence that Black communities, brown communities are more likely to be facing the grave consequences of the climate crisis that other communities are not to the same degree. And so this is important for us to consider when we're thinking about climate adaptation and where we need to potentially focus resources. So to close out, I think that I want to emphasize this point about knowledge and whose knowledge do we privilege, and to reiterate this point that in order to think effectively, not think, but implement climate adaptation and respond to the climate crisis, we're going to have to rely on expertise beyond Columbia and beyond what can be produced through academic science. So to maximize our ability to adapt to climate change, we must be positioned to accelerate support for groundbreaking climate science research that's already in progress, but also quickly translate existing and emerging science into practice. And that requires relationships and knowledge that exist beyond this, outside of academic spaces. That we'll need to integrate knowledge and expertise from every corner, not only from the university, but from around society. And this requires that we humbly accept that knowledge and solutions will not emerge exclusively from the university or from Columbia, but also from communities whose work and collaboration will be critical to our progress, and to account for and respond to the reality that the climate crisis is not and will not impact us all equally. And I think it's a special intersection when we're thinking about people who represent these communities who have been historically oppressed, who also are able to deeply engage in the academic science as well, which I think is also incredibly valuable. Article. We're really interested in, say, how you would listen to a scientific talk and how you, Axel, and other people in OFIS would take that information and translate it to make it more accessible to a broader audience, and then help us think through what are the best mechanisms for communicating this with different communities and different stakeholders. And it's not always Twitter, and it's not always paper or an academic paper. So the idea of it's exactly the kind of thing we're interested in having conversations about, is how do you get it into the hands of people who need it and make sure that it makes sense and is an accessible